We
They
gather
called
in
every
solemn
name beneath the
remembrance of
cold morning sun,
sacrifices made
every
for our
rank,
freedom.
every medal,
Their legacy
every hero.
endures in the crisp
But
morning
when
air.
it came to the one who had run straight into fire, the German shepherd who pulled 2 wounded soldiers out of a burning convoy and refused to leave them, the podium went silent, because the ribbon meant for Atlas. It had already been sealed inside a box, filed away, buried under procedure, erased by a system that didn't know how to speak a dog's name. Until one Navy SEAL, Calder Brooks, stepped forward with the truth. With the drone footage, with the mission logs, with proof so undeniable that the entire command room fell silent, and the system was finally forced to say the name it had tried to forget. Stay with us, because this isn't a story about medals. It's about loyalty, about courage that never asked for applause, and the gentle way truth finds its way home. The sky above the northern military base in Maine wore a thick blanket of winter clouds, heavy and still, as though the world was pausing out of respect. A faint Atlantic wind brushed past the flags lining the parade ground, lifting them only slightly before letting them fall again. The air was cold enough to nip at the skin, but the soldiers stood unmoving, rows of polished boots and pressed uniforms glowing softly under the pale daylight that was already beginning to fade. Standing among them was Calder Brooks. He was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet stillness of a man who had spent his life walking alongside danger rather than running from it. His hair was dark brown, trimmed short, and there was a faint scar near his right temple that hinted at a past he never spoke about. His eyes were deep, measured, and thoughtful. Calder rarely used more words than necessary, not because he was distant, but because life had taught him that silence could be kinder than careless speech. Beneath that silence, however, lived loyalty, unwavering, steady, immovable. At Calder's side sat Atlas, his German shepherd partner. Atlas was 5 years old, with a powerful, lean body and a black and tan coat that seemed to catch every sliver of light. His ears were always alert, but there was a softness in his amber eyes that felt almost human. Atlas carried himself like a quiet guardian, disciplined yet gentle. A faint scar along his left shoulder whispered of nights nobody wanted to remember, but it had never dimmed the calm strength that radiated from him. And in rare, peaceful moments he would rest his chin on Calder's boot, as if reminding them both that companionship was its own kind of armor. At the front of the formation stood Colonel James Harrow. He was in his late 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair and lines etched deep across a face that had seen more than it ever admitted. He was a fair man who valued order, partly because he believed rules kept chaos at bay. A tragedy long ago had carved caution into his heart ever since the day he lost his younger brother in a training mishap. Duty mattered to him, structure mattered, and today he read the names of those who had been commended for acts of courage. His voice carried steadily across the field as he spoke each name. Applause followed each one, gentle but sincere, rippling through the cold air like distant ocean surf. One of those names belonged to Lieutenant Sarah Donnelly. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with light brown hair tied neatly back. Her eyes were soft yet shadowed by grief, for years before she had lost the man she loved to war. Instead of hardening, her heart had learned patience and quiet strength. She accepted her medal with humility, like someone receiving a gift meant for another. Snow began to fall then, thin white flakes drifting lazily from the sky, turning the ceremony into something that felt almost sacred. Calder stood quietly. Atlas remained still beside him, composed and attentive. Somewhere deep inside, Calder knew the program by heart. He knew what would be said, and what would not. Then the final page was turned. This concludes today's commendations. Applause again, gentle, polite, respectful. But Atlas's name had never been spoken, not because anyone doubted his courage, only because the system had never learned how to call a dog a soldier. Calder exhaled softly. There was no anger in him, Only the slow ache of truth left waiting. He lowered his hand and rested it gently on Atlas's back. Atlas leaned into the touch with calm certainty, and inside Calder's heart a quiet promise formed. One day they would learn how to say his name too. By the time darkness folded itself across the base, the snow had stopped falling. The parade ground, once filled with voices and ceremony, now rested beneath quiet lamps that glowed faintly through the chill. The flags hung motionless. The world felt paused, as though even the night refused to disturb what had already passed. Calder walked slowly along the corridor toward the administrative offices, his footsteps soft and measured. He had removed his ceremonial cap, and the cold air brushed gently against his dark hair. Atlas moved beside him in silent companionship, each step calm, steady, unhurried. Under the sterile hallway light, his coat gleamed like burnished bronze. They reached the records desk, where a young clerk sat on duty. His name was Evan Marsh, barely 22, with sandy hair and freckles across a face that still held innocence. He was polite, respectful, and quietly earnest. The loss of his father when he was 10 had carved responsibility into him early, and he treated every task as though it mattered. He greeted Calder softly, then printed the commendation entries. Calder stepped aside and began to read. The words were careful, official, detached. They described chaos in neat paragraphs: fire, confusion, rescue. Then came the commendation list. At the top, Major Trent Holloway. Holloway was tall, sharp-featured, always neatly groomed. He carried himself with rigid precision. Ambitious, disciplined, and cautious to a fault, his need for control had deep roots in an earlier mission that almost went wrong under his command. Procedure, for him, had become armor. The report praised leadership, coordination, command presence. Then, near the bottom, Calder found it. K9 Atlas, assisted in recovery and support. 5 small words. He stared at them quietly. Atlas shifted slightly and looked up, eyes full of quiet trust. Calder rested a hand on his neck. There was no bitterness in him, only sorrow softened by understanding. Later that night they sat together in the dim team room. The air smelled faintly of leather and old coffee. Atlas stretched out on the floor beside Calder, his head resting gently against Calder's boot. He was calm, peaceful. Dogs do not question worth. After a while, Lieutenant Sarah Donnelly stepped in. Her presence was always gentle, never intrusive. She had known grief, and grief had taught her kindness. She saw the report. She saw Atlas. And she simply said softly, "Sometimes the rules learn late." Then she left them to the quiet. The base settled into sleep. Calder did not rail against the world. He simply sat beside the one soul who had already proven everything that mattered. Atlas's eyes closed slowly, peaceful and bright even in darkness. And so the night passed, without applause. The small coastal town in Maine seemed to breathe alongside the Atlantic, as if the tide itself carried the rhythm of its heart. Wooden houses leaned into the salty wind, roofs dusted with the memory of winters past. Fishing boats rested at the harbor like tired guardians, their paint peeling but proud. The late afternoon sky glowed in shades of soft amber and fading rose, the sunlight stretching its last golden fingers across the shoreline before sinking back into the horizon. On the edge of town stood a modest veterinary clinic with white siding and a blue door that had been repainted more times than anyone remembered. A wind chime hung from the porch, playing quiet music whenever the sea breeze wandered through. A hand-painted sign above the window read, "Doyle Veterinary Care." Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and ocean salt, mixed with the comforting scent of worn leather chairs and brewed tea. Marin Doyle moved gently through the space as if it were an extension of her breath. She was 28, with copper-red hair that waved loosely around her shoulders, like autumn leaves lit by firelight. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled, and her eyes were a warm green that always seemed to be listening, not only to people, but to the silence between them. She was not tall, but carried herself with grace and quiet steadiness, the kind that made frightened animals calm without knowing why. Her voice was soft, careful, patient. Years earlier, when she was still a teenager, she had held a trembling beagle through its final moments after being struck by a careless driver. No one else stayed. She did. That day had carved something tender and resolute inside her. Since then, she had refused to turn away from pain, whether it had a voice or only a heartbeat. She believed in kindness that did not ask for applause, and she believed deeply in fairness, even when the world forgot it. The bell above the door chimed softly as Calder Brooks stepped inside with Atlas walking calmly at his side. The change in setting formed a new kind of quiet, not military quiet, but the stillness of a place that wanted to heal. Marin looked up from the counter, a hint of a smile already in her eyes. She had never met Calder before, but there was something familiar in the way he moved, as though every step weighed memory. He greeted her with a nod, his dark eyes steady, his voice low. Atlas followed gently, and Marin's gaze softened when she saw him. Animals always spoke to her without words. She guided them into the exam room where soft lighting replaced the bright sterility of normal clinics. A faded seascape painting hung on the wall, and a worn blanket covered the metal table. Calder lifted Atlas with slow care, and the dog settled without complaint, trusting the world because Calder trusted it. Marin moved with quiet confidence, her hands gentle but precise as she examined the faint scar along Atlas's shoulder and the roughened patch near his flank. Close up, she could see more than just healed wounds. She could see history. She listened to Atlas's heartbeat. Strong, steady, brave. She observed the way he held tension, not fear, just readiness. The posture of someone who had learned to carry danger without letting it spill into those around him. She did not pry, but she knew. There was a story here far larger than the few words printed in a medical summary, and it was not the kind of story that needed headlines, just dignity. Across the room, Calder stood with the same stillness he'd worn on the parade ground. He watched every movement, not distrusting her, simply staying close to the only constant he had left. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He's healed, mostly, but some of the strain returns when the weather changes. Marin nodded, her tone equally soft. Some wounds remember the seasons. There was no pity in her voice, only respect. Atlas lifted his amber gaze toward her as if he understood she saw him not as an instrument, but as a soul. For a moment, the room felt like a sanctuary tucked safely inside the wide world. Then the door opened gently, and a woman entered carrying a chart. This was Helen Price, the clinic assistant. She was in her 40s with short dark hair and kind, tired eyes that had seen more than she wished, but still chose compassion every morning. She was practical, efficient, and deeply loyal to Marin. She didn't say much, but when she did, it was always real. She paused when she saw Atlas, then smiled quietly. Some animals commanded reverence. She sensed it instantly. Marin finished the examination, then stepped back. He's strong, healthy, but his muscles still hold the memory of what happened. Regular rest, gentle conditioning, and she hesitated briefly. He deserves to be acknowledged for what he's carried. Calder didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. Silence filled the space like a companion. The fading sun bled red across the window as evening began to paint the sky. The amber glow wrapped the room in warmth, as though the world itself wanted to hold them for a moment longer. In that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, Marin did not want to change the world. She had no grand crusade, no appetite for politics or arguments or loud declarations. She only believed that fairness should reach the places it belonged. And something inside her knew. Atlas's name had not yet been allowed to stand where it deserved. They stepped outside as the last sliver of sun touched the sea, setting the water aflame with molten light. The harbor bells chimed in the distance. Seabirds called overhead, gliding through the crimson evening sky. Atlas stood beside Calder, his silhouette steady against the fiery horizon. Marin watched them with a quiet resolve that was stronger than steel despite its softness. 2 humans, 1 dog, and a truth waiting beneath the surface, like a pearl still hidden inside its shell. The day closed gently around them, and without fanfare, without witnesses, without applause, their journey toward that truth quietly began. The morning broke slow and gray over the base, the kind of light that arrived without ceremony, slipping gently over rooftops and seeping into windows like a memory that didn't want to disturb anyone. The fog rolled low across the ground, softening every edge until the world felt hushed, as though the day itself understood that some truths needed quiet to be heard. Inside the administrative building, fluorescent lights hummed softly above long hallways lined with closed doors, bulletin boards, and framed commendations. Paper lived here, reports, records, typed words that claimed to capture moments where lives bent and futures shifted. Calder Brooks moved through this place as if tracing the outline of a ghost he refused to lose. His steps were even, unrushed, but there was a purpose beneath every movement. Atlas padded beside him, the German shepherd's ears turning with every small sound, his gait steady and calm, his presence like a heartbeat walking beside Calder. They entered the records office where a handful of clerks worked quietly at computer terminals. One of them, a woman in her late 30s named Laura Kendall, glanced up. She was of medium height, with chestnut hair pulled neatly into a bun and a pair of glasses perched low on her nose. Her face wore the expression of someone who had spent years navigating systems, rules, and the fragile pride of officers. She was efficient, careful, and discreet. People trusted her not because she spoke much, but because she never said more than she should. Calder approached calmly. His voice was low but firm. "I need access to mission documentation for Convoy Raqqa, all branches involved." She hesitated only briefly. There was respect in the pause, not resistance. Then she nodded and gestured toward a workstation. Within minutes, rows of files appeared on the screen. Layers of reports, command summaries, debriefs, statistical logs. Night blurred into data. Calder read, and read, and read. He found nothing erased, no vanished line, no missing page. The record was there, just written with careful restraint, the kind that trimmed truth into something tidy and acceptable. Atlas, assisted in recovery, 5 words, still there, still small. Calder leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. There was no betrayal inside these walls, only structure, language shaped by precedent. He turned toward Atlas, who sat calmly at his side, ever watchful, ever present. The dog's amber eyes reflected quiet patience, as if reminding Calder that worth was not measured by ink. Still, there was something unresolved, something unfinished, something that had not yet had a chance to stand in light. So the search deepened. Later that afternoon, the sky had cleared, revealing a pale blue expanse stretching out toward the ocean. The wind had sharpened, carrying with it the smell of salt and cold metal. Calder made his way toward an older section of the base where the more tightly controlled archives were kept, the kind of place where access came not from rank alone, but from trust. This was the administrative wing overseen by Admiral Rowan Pierce. Rowan Pierce was a man in his early 60s, tall and lean, his frame still carrying the disciplined posture of a younger officer. His hair had gone silver, not suddenly but gradually, like snow gathering quietly on a mountainside. His face bore lines of thought rather than anger, and his eyes were the calm blue of open water, observant, reflective, steady. He had served long enough to see systems break and mend, and he believed deeply in order, but even more deeply in integrity. A loss early in his career, a close friend miscredited and forgotten, had etched a permanent resolve into him. Truth should never be negotiated into silence. When Calder entered his office, he stood extending a hand in greeting. His voice was warm but grounded. "I heard you've been reviewing records." Calder nodded. He did not dramatize. He simply spoke plainly. "The record is there, but the way it's written. Atlas disappears inside the wording." Pierce listened without interruption. He did not rush to defend the system. He did not dismiss the concern. He simply considered it. And then he granted something rare. "Let's look deeper." They descended together into the secure archive room, a quiet chamber lined with steel cabinets and secured consoles. The air was cool, humming faintly with electronics and history. Here, raw mission surveillance was stored, not summaries, not edits, just unfiltered capture. Atlas followed, moving like a guardian of forgotten truth. Pierce entered access credentials that only a handful on base possessed. Then he searched and found recon feed, nighttime, time-stamped, unaltered. He opened the file, and the room fell into silence. The thermal footage flickered to life on the screen, black and white, heat signatures glowing like ghosts carved out of darkness. Flames roared in muted silence. Vehicles burned bright, radiant against the cold surrounding terrain. Smoke bled upward like a wounded cloud. Shapes moved, chaos with structure, fear with courage. Then Atlas appeared, a low, darting silhouette, not panicked, but focused, slicing through heat and hazard with disciplined purpose. He vanished behind the burning wreckage, then re-emerged, tugging, pulling, dragging a limp human form toward what little safety existed. His body strained, every tendon carved into purpose. There was no hesitation. He delivered the man to hands that could save him, then turned back, without command, without reward, without fear, into the fire once more. Calder watched, his jaw tightening slightly, though his eyes remained calm, not shocked, not surprised, just seen. Pierce leaned closer, his expression still but full of thought. "That," he said quietly, "is not assistance. That is action." The footage continued, a silent sermon of loyalty and courage. Twice Atlas disappeared into flame. Twice he returned bearing life. And through it all, there was no frenzy about him. Only a strange calm, the steadiness of a creature whose heart had already decided that devotion was worth the burn. When the final frame paused, the room remained still. Even the machine seemed to fall into reverence. Calder exhaled slowly. A small smile, not of triumph, but of relief, softened his features. As if the world had finally whispered back the truth it had kept hidden beneath paperwork and policy. Atlas sat beside him, gaze steady, unaware that his story had just stepped into the light. Pierce turned to Calder. "This exists," he said, "and that means it can be seen. Not shouted, not weaponized, just allowed to live in honesty." Calder nodded. There was no gloating in him, only gratitude that the truth had a voice again, even if that voice spoke softly, line by line. Outside, the late afternoon sun began to set, flooding the horizon with streaks of copper and rose. The base looked different beneath that light, less like a fortress, more like a place where people tried, in their imperfect ways, to do right. Calder placed a hand gently on Atlas's back. The dog leaned into it, steady as always. And for the first time since the ceremony, Calder felt something ease inside him, like a long-held breath gently released. The world had not changed today, but it had listened, and sometimes that was the beginning. Morning light washed across the base in a pale sweep of gold, quiet and unassuming, as though the sun itself knew that today was meant for things spoken softly rather than declared. The horizon still carried the faint blush of dawn when Admiral Rowan Pierce stepped out of his residence, his breath rising in thin white clouds. He walked with the steady grace of a man who no longer rushed toward purpose, but allowed purpose to walk beside him. His hair had gone silver with the years, strands glinting under the fragile morning light. His posture remained straight, but not rigid, as if his back remembered duty, while his heart remembered mercy. He made his way toward the operations wing, the one building on base that always seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the hallways were marked not by noise, but by the echo of decisions made in rooms where no one else would ever sit. Pierce had long ago learned that power did not live in volume. It lived in restraint. And today, restraint would matter more than anything. He paused at his office door, then entered. The room reflected his nature: neat, functional, spare. Dark wooden shelves lined one wall, filled not with awards but with books, history, philosophy, leadership. A single framed photograph rested on his desk, showing a younger Pierce standing beside another officer, both laughing freely. That other man had been forgotten in an early commendation scandal decades earlier, wrongly placed beneath others in a report. The system had corrected itself eventually, but only after damage had settled in. Pierce had never forgotten that lesson. Truth did not need applause, only room to stand. He stood by the window for a long moment before sitting and drafting the request. His handwriting was firm, deliberate. He did not accuse, he did not dramatize. He simply stated that due to new evidence, a closed review hearing would be convened to evaluate the commendation record associated with the Raqqa convoy ambush. He emphasized confidentiality, respect, dignity, no headlines, no spectacle, just clarity. When the message left his desk, it became a quiet stone dropped into still water. Waves began to move. Later that afternoon, Calder Brooks was summoned to the administrative wing. He arrived with Atlas walking at his side, the German shepherd's gait calm and silent. Atlas's ears flicked lightly at every sound, eyes bright but peaceful. He carried the presence of something steadfast, not eager, not anxious, simply ready. Pierce greeted Calder in the hallway. They exchanged a simple nod. No theatrics, no ceremony. Just two men who understood that words should not be wasted. "I'm opening a review proceeding," Pierce said, his tone composed, almost gentle. "Closed session, select officers only, neutral panel, evidence-based." Calder studied him for a quiet heartbeat. Then he answered in his measured voice, "That's all I ever hoped for." Atlas leaned gently against Calder's leg, sensing the shift in atmosphere, reading the tone rather than the content. Dogs always know the shape of human air. The notice went out to the necessary parties. The review panel would include 2 senior officers and 1 civilian legal advisor attached to the Department of Defense. The civilian representative was Martin Hale, a man in his late 40s with calm gray eyes and salt-speckled hair. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who believed in laws not as weapons, but as safeguards. He dressed plainly, spoke carefully, and had a habit of listening longer than most people found comfortable. Years earlier, he had lost a case involving a veteran whose medical benefits were denied due to technical wording. From that day forward, he had vowed to listen beyond the letter to find the spirit. Major Trent Holloway received the notice as well. He sat in his private office when the message came through. His posture stiffened as he read the words. Tall, sharply groomed, his uniform impeccable, he had always believed in the righteousness of rules, not out of vanity, but out of fear that chaos would return if he loosened his grip. He stared at the screen for a long while, jaw set, before finally closing the laptop. His expression did not show anger, only discomfort, because deep down he had seen the footage too, and though he had not erased Atlas's contribution, he had once allowed silence to speak where truth should have stood more clearly. The day of the hearing came quietly. No flags were raised for it. No announcements were made. The proceedings took place in a windowless conference room with walls painted a muted gray. A long wooden table stretched across the space, polished smooth but worn at the edges from years of elbows leaning into hard conversations. Pierce entered first and sat at the head of the table. His face was calm, his eyes steady, his presence filling the room not through dominance, but through quiet assurance. Martin Hale arrived next, carrying a small notebook and pen, his suit modest and well-pressed. Then came the two senior officers assigned to the panel, both experienced, measured, men who had seen war enough to understand that glory rarely matched the paperwork written afterward. Calder stepped in with Atlas at heel. Atlas settled into a calm down position at Calder's side without needing instruction, his amber eyes scanning the room with gentle alertness. He did not whine, did not fidget. He simply existed, composed and faithful. Major Holloway entered soon after. His shoulders were squared, chin lifted, expression carefully neutral. He took his seat opposite Calder, keeping his hands clasped together in front of him. Pierce opened the session with a tone that felt almost like prayer. "This is not a trial," he said. "This is not an indictment. This is a review of record. We are here to ask whether the truth has been written as faithfully as it deserves." He glanced down briefly, then spoke again. Honor does not require an audience. It simply needs to stand in the right place. Silence followed, the good kind, the kind that makes room. The recon footage was presented next. No commentary, no narrative voice. Just the stark, unfiltered truth of thermal light moving through darkness. Flames bloomed, figures scrambled, and then Atlas, silent, determined, disappearing into the blaze and returning with life gripped gently in his jaws. Martin Hale watched intently, brows knitting slightly, not with doubt, but with recognition that the law was sometimes late to the heart. The panel reviewed medical reports, radio transcripts, timeline logs, every piece aligned. Calder spoke briefly when asked. He did not embellish. He simply described. Holloway was invited to speak as well. His voice was steady. A hint of tension lived beneath it, but not malice. "My intention was order," he said. "I believed commendations must follow the chain of command, but looking now, yes, the record may have failed to give full weight to the actions observed. It was not a confession. It was an acknowledgment, and it mattered." Pierce closed the file and rested his hands lightly against the table. This hearing is not about rewriting hierarchy. It is about recognizing that courage wears many forms. His voice softened further. And some of those forms have 4 legs. The panel members nodded, each in their own thoughtful way. The door to truth, quiet and patient, had finally opened, not with anger, not with fire, but with respect. Atlas remained still, unaware that the world had shifted slightly around him, unaware that his devotion had just found its way closer to the light. Calder lowered his gaze and breathed out slowly, as if a weight he had carried had finally learned how to rest. Outside, the sky had begun to darken into evening blue, and the first distant stars blinked awake above the base. The day slipped away without fanfare, but something sacred had taken its place. Not victory, not triumph, just honesty allowed to stand where it belonged. The conference room felt different the next morning, as if the walls themselves had begun to listen. The muted gray paint seemed softer somehow, the air less heavy, as though the space had learned overnight that it was meant not to judge, but to witness. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across a pale sky, the light filtered and gentle, avoiding harshness. Inside, the table waited. Chairs waited. Truth waited. Admiral Rowan Pierce entered first. His silver hair caught the dim light, giving him the appearance of someone carved gently from winter. His steady blue eyes swept the room not out of suspicion, but from long habit, the instinctive scan of a man used to guarding what mattered. He moved with calm intention, taking his seat without fanfare, folding his hands loosely in front of him. He did not need to command the room. His presence did that for him. Martin Hale arrived next, carrying his notebook, shoulders slightly hunched the way careful thinkers often were. His gray-flecked hair and thoughtful gaze suggested a man who weighed words the way jewelers weighed stones. He greeted Pierce quietly, then took his place, pen ready but not yet moving. To him, law was not a blade, it was a lantern. The two senior officers entered as well, both bearing the composed stillness of men who had seen enough loss to understand reverence. They took their seats without chatter. Then the door opened again. Calder Brooks stepped in with Atlas at heel. Calder's dark eyes were calm, his face composed, yet there was something different about him today, a stillness with purpose. He wore his uniform not as display, but as duty stitched into cloth. Atlas walked beside him, strong yet serene, his thick black and tan coat sleek under the room's soft light. The German shepherd's amber eyes swept quietly over the gathering before he lay down at Calder's side, paws neatly outstretched, head lifted and alert. He did not know this moment would change anything. He only knew he belonged here. Major Trent Holloway entered last. His gait was measured, his posture precise. His blond hair was immaculately groomed, his uniform crisp. Yet beneath the surface, lines of unease traced his expression. He was not a cruel man, only one who had long believed that rules were the only shield against chaos. But today, those same rules stood beside a truth that had not been fully spoken. When the room settled, Admiral Pierce gave a simple nod. "Begin." The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered on. No music, no narration, no guiding voice telling anyone what to feel. Just raw footage. The drone's thermal eye revealed darkness broken by flame, white-hot shapes of metal and fire against black night. Smoke spiraled upward like a wounded spirit. Movement flickered through the chaos, soldiers scrambling, heat signatures flaring and dimming like distant stars caught in a storm. Then Atlas appeared, a silent arc of motion low to the ground, purposeful. He slipped through the burning wreck as though he had bargained with the fire itself. He vanished into brightness, returned with life cradled carefully in his jaws. Muscles strained, body bowed, not frenzied, not desperate, just determined. The room did not breathe. The panel watched in reverent stillness as Atlas dragged the wounded soldier beyond the reach of the flame, placing him into saving hands before turning back toward the inferno again, as though loyalty were a compass fixed true north. He went back, again and again, uncommanded, unrewarded, certain. When the video ended, the screen froze on a single frame of Atlas standing just beyond the smoke, chest rising evenly, eyes sharp, posture steady, like a guardian carved from devotion. Silence followed, not awkward silence, sacred silence. Martin Hale set down his pen. He did not need notes. The truth had already been written inside him. Admiral Pierce let the hush rest there for a moment longer, honoring it. Then quietly he spoke. "There is nothing here that requires embellishment." No one disagreed. The panel moved through the remainder of the evidence, not to challenge it, but to ensure that what was felt was also supported by fact. Medical records were reviewed, timeline logs confirmed, statements aligned. Finally, Major Holloway was invited to speak. He sat straighter, clearing his throat softly. His sharp features were composed, but his eyes carried the faint tremor of a man confronting his own reflection. "My intention was not to diminish anyone," he said. "I followed procedure, command oversight, structural acknowledgement. But yes, The written record failed to reflect the full truth of Atlas's actions. There was no defensiveness, only honesty finally finding its footing. Calder remained silent, one hand resting lightly against Atlas's shoulders. He did not need to add anything. Atlas's voice had already filled the room, even without sound. Martin Hale leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. Systems sometimes lag behind reality, and sometimes courage forces them to catch up. It was neither blame nor praise, just truth. Pierce folded his hands again, eyes softening. This board recommends that the mission record be amended to formally recognize K9 Atlas for direct rescue action under fire, he said. His contribution will be documented at the same level of formal commendation attribution as the personnel saved through his actions. He paused. And it will be written truthfully. The senior officers nodded. The decision was not dramatic. It did not thunder. It simply settled into place, firm and right. Major Holloway lowered his gaze, exhaling slowly. He was not stripped of honor. He was not shamed. But he bowed inwardly to the reality that had always deserved a voice. Sometimes the fault lay less in men and more in the structures they inherited. Atlas shifted slightly, amber eyes returning to Calder's face as if asking whether it was time to leave, or time to rest. Calder smiled faintly, the kind of smile made of relief rather than joy. The review concluded. The amendments would be processed. Official, permanent, written. Not as a favor, but as truth. The chairs scraped lightly against the floor as people stood. No applause, no backslapping, just respectful nods. Quiet acknowledgement. A reverence fit for the kind of courage that never asked to be celebrated. Admiral Pierce paused before leaving. He rested his gaze on Atlas. "You served," he said simply. Then he left the room. Calder knelt beside Atlas, resting his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Now the record remembers," he whispered. Atlas leaned into him, warm and steady, unaware that history had just remembered how to speak his name correctly. And somewhere inside the stillness of that simple room, truth came home. The morning rose softly over the base, not with brilliance, but with a gentle warmth that slipped across the horizon like a whisper of forgiveness. The sky was a pale blue brushed with threads of gold, the air cool enough to draw a faint mist from every breath. Dew clung to the edges of the parade ground, turning the grass into a field of tiny mirrors that caught the sunlight and scattered it gently across the earth. It was the kind of dawn that did not ask to be noticed. It simply arrived, steady and calm, like truth itself. Soldiers gathered in orderly lines across the field, boots aligned, uniforms pressed, expressions solemn. There were no banners, no recorded speeches, no brass instruments gleaming under the sun, only the sound of quiet breathing and the faint rustle of fabric as men and women took their places. Calder Brooks stood among them, his tall frame straight but relaxed, as if strength no longer needed to brace itself. His dark hair caught the light along the edges, and the lines of restraint that usually traced his features had softened. There was a steadiness in his gaze today, a grounded peace that came not from victory, but from resolution. Beside him sat Atlas, his black and tan coat shimmering under the morning sun, amber eyes peaceful as they followed the slow movements of the world around him. Atlas had no idea what the day meant. He only knew Calder was calm. So he was calm. Across the field, Admiral Rowan Pierce walked slowly toward the center. His silver hair glowed faintly beneath the rising light, and his uniform carried the quiet dignity of years marked by discipline and compassion. His steps were measured, unhurried, like a man delivering something fragile to where it finally belonged. He paused briefly, scanning the formation, not to judge it, but to acknowledge it. There was no stage, no elevation. He simply stopped where the ground was level, beneath every foot. Martin Hale stood among the gathered observers, his gray-flecked hair gently stirred by the breeze, his tired but kind eyes reflecting a deep, steady satisfaction. He believed in moments like this, where the law stepped quietly into alignment with what the heart had known all along. Lieutenant Sarah Donnelly stood toward the rear of the formation. Her tall, slender frame looked almost fragile in the brightness of morning, but there was strength in the way she held herself. The grief she once carried like armor had softened into grace. And when she looked toward Atlas, her gentle eyes warmed with something close to gratitude. No one spoke. No one needed to. Admiral Pierce nodded once toward Calder. Calder stepped forward with Atlas, the German shepherd, walking at his heel with natural poise. His tail rested low, relaxed, his ears tilted forward in curious calm. To him, this was simply another walk beside the human who had never let go of the leash, even when the world had. They reached the center of the field. The formation stood silent, not stiff, just reverent. Pierce held a small velvet box, though it was not opened yet. In his other hand lay a narrow ribbon, not the primary medal, but a symbolic adornment meant for the working harness that had carried Atlas through fire and smoke. He knelt, not to diminish himself, but to meet Atlas where he was. His movement alone seemed to ripple softly through the gathering. Atlas tilted his head, ears lifting slightly. He remained perfectly still, as if sensing that this quiet act carried weight, even if he did not understand it. With careful hands, Pierce clipped the ribbon onto the upper strap of Atlas's harness. The colors rested gently against the worn fabric, scarred by use and time. He spoke not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried. For service rendered beyond what is asked, for courage that expected nothing in return. He looked into Atlas's amber eyes. You served. There was no applause, no calls of approval, no cheering, only the profound hush that follows when something holy has taken place, even in a world that rarely uses that word. Calder stood beside Atlas, eyes steady, chest lifting with a quiet breath that seemed to release years of unspoken hope. Admiral Pierce rose, then placed the unopened metal box into Calder's hand, the official commendation meant for archival honor and record. Calder accepted it not for himself, but as guardian of the truth it contained. Across the formation, a few smiles appeared, soft and human. Someone at the far end exhaled a shaky laugh under their breath. Because at that exact moment, Atlas tilted his head, ears perked, eyes bright with innocent curiosity, as if asking the world the most important question it had forgotten to answer. Was there, perhaps, a snack involved? That small, wordless query slipped through the rigid lines of military formality, like sunlight through a half-open window. A gentle ripple of quiet amusement moved through the ranks, not loud, not disrespectful, simply warm. A few shoulders relaxed, a few lips curved upward. It was as though the base itself remembered that honor, at its deepest root, was born from love rather than fear. Sarah Donnelly lowered her gaze for a moment, smiling softly to herself. In her heart, something long burdened settled gently into place. Martin Hale exhaled slowly, his grip on his notebook easing. Major Trent Holloway watched in silence. There was no resentment in his eyes now, only reflection. Perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he even felt relief that truth could stand on its own without tearing down anyone else to do so. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt and early sunlight. Flags whispered faintly. Boots remained grounded. The formation held, not rigid but unified, as though every heart there understood that this moment belonged not to a man or rank or office, but to a bond that had once faced fire and chosen loyalty without hesitation. Admiral Pierce stepped back. Calder rested a hand gently along Atlas's neck. Atlas leaned into the touch, calm and content, unaware that the world had just written his name where it could never be erased. There were no speeches, there were no declarations, because some victories are too sacred for noise. And so, beneath the early sun, surrounded by straight lines of silent witnesses and a scattering of soft smiles, a quiet correction was made. A truth once faded was restored. And for the first time, the morning did not need trumpets. The memo arrived without ceremony, drifting quietly through the base like a soft wind that rustles leaves without bending branches. It was written in careful language, each word weighed and measured, every sentence stitched with restraint. It did not shout. It did not boast. It simply stated that within the base command structure, military working dogs would now be eligible for formal recognition of valor when their actions exceeded mission protocol. No loopholes, no footnotes. Just acknowledgement. Steady, sincere, earned. The news first reached the administrative wing where clerks and officers moved through their day with familiar rhythm. Papers shuffled, footsteps echoed, coffee cooled slowly on desks. And somewhere between the ordinary motions of routine, something quietly changed. When Laura Kendall, the records clerk with chestnut hair and calm composure, read the directive, she paused for a moment. Her brows lifted slightly. Then she smiled, the smallest flicker of warmth softening the usual discipline of her features. Because paperwork was no longer merely record, it had become witness. Word traveled through the K9 compound next. Handlers read it, some aloud, some silently, and shoulders seemed to straighten without effort. Men and women who had long treated their dogs as partners, even when forms called them equipment, felt the truth finally echo back to them. A few reached down instinctively to scratch behind a loyal ear or rest a hand against a familiar neck. The dogs, unaware of the system that had just bowed its head, simply leaned into the affection, content that love remained unchanged. Calder Brooks stood by the training field when he heard. The air smelled faintly of dew and sun-warmed earth, and the sky stretched wide and open above. He watched Atlas run through a set of obedience drills, muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat, movements fluid and confident. Atlas was not performing. He was simply being who he had always been, devoted, disciplined, quietly joyful in the presence of purpose. When Calder was handed the memo, he read it only once. He did not speak, but his eyes softened and a still gladness settled into the lines of his face. He folded the page carefully, as if it were something fragile, and slipped it into his pocket like a promise gently kept. Life did not transform dramatically. There were no celebrations, just a subtle shift, a gentle realignment of the world, a direction corrected. Slowly, because real change rarely hurries. And yet, once set in motion, it continued on its way like a river, learning a truer path. In the weeks that followed, Atlas continued to serve, not as gear, not as a classified tool, but as a recognized comrade. Handlers from other units would pause sometimes to watch him work, admiring the calm intelligence in his steady gaze. New recruits learned his name, not as legend, but as example. And Atlas, with no awareness of policy, simply carried on as he always had, clear-eyed, loyal, steadfast. He became a kind of quiet anchor for the base, a reminder that courage can walk on four legs. Calder's role shifted too. He began working with a developing program that focused on the long-term well-being of K9 partners, not only in the field, but beyond service. The program was coordinated by a small, thoughtful woman named Dr. Evelyn Hart. She was 50, with silver-streaked brown hair and calm hazel eyes that reflected a lifetime of listening. Her voice was soft, yet direct, shaped by years supporting veterans through difficult transitions. She believed deeply that loyalty went both ways, and that those who served deserved to be cared for in return. She welcomed Calder's experience with quiet gratitude, recognizing in him not just a soldier, but a guardian of something deeply human. Meanwhile, in the coastal town of Maine, the Blue Door of Doyle Veterinary Care now opened more frequently to retired working dogs. Marin Doyle had begun to transform a nearby property, once a weathered farmhouse, into a sanctuary for K-9 veterans. The land rested gently near the sea, where wind played through tall grass and gulls traced wide circles across the sky. Fences were built, soft beds laid out, shade trees preserved. It was not a grand institution. It was a place of warmth, a place where tired paws could rest without guilt. Marin worked with sleeves rolled and hair pulled loosely back, freckles touched golden by the sun. She welcomed each dog with the same quiet reverence she had shown Atlas that first evening, speaking softly, touching gently, listening deeply. To the world, she was a veterinarian. To the animals, she was sanctuary wrapped in skin. Helen Price, loyal and steady, helped catalog records and prepare food, humming quietly to herself as she worked. She had always believed kindness should appear in ordinary hours, and now she found joy in being part of something that mended invisible seams. Sometimes Calder visited on weekends when schedules allowed. He would arrive in a pickup coated lightly with salt air, Atlas riding calmly in the back seat, ears flicking at every sound of the sea. They would walk the coastal path while the wind stitched tangles through Calder's dark hair and tousled Atlas's fur. The world there felt softer, kinder, as though waves washed the hardness off everything they touched. They spoke rarely. They did not need to. Peace has a way of speaking for itself. Sarah Donnelly visited once as well. Tall, slender, carrying the grace of a willow swaying but never breaking, she stood quietly by the fence and watched Atlas move through the grass. Her grief, once sharp, now felt like a soft thread woven into the fabric of her being, rather than a weight pressing against her chest. She smiled when Atlas trotted over and rested his head against her hand. She stroked his fur slowly, gratitude filling the spaces where sorrow once lived. Back at the base, Admiral Pierce continued his duties, silver hair glinting under office lights, his expression thoughtful and composed. He did not take pride in the policy shift. He simply felt relief that the system had learned, however slowly, to bow to truth rather than convenience. He kept working, believing change must be tended like a flame, protected from wind and neglect. And always, behind it all, the memo continued its journey, eventually rising through the quiet layers of command review. Each level read, considered, debated in soft-toned meetings, adjusted with careful pen strokes. Progress came slowly, patient and deliberate, but it came, because once the world learns a new kindness, it rarely forgets. Atlas continued training, continued serving, continued living each day with the same calm devotion he always had. He was not proud. He was not aware of honor or record. But when someone spoke his name now, there was a different tone in their voice, not novelty, not surprise, simply respect. And hearts that had once carried fractures began to knit back together. Calder's, Marin's, Sarah's, even Holloway's in his own quiet way, not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, like light returning to a room long kept dim. Happy ending, but not a fairy tale, because the world did not magically right every wrong. It simply took one step closer to being what it should have been all along. And somewhere between the base and the sea, and the quiet places where truth rests its head, Atlas lifted his gaze toward Calder and wagged his tail once, slow and steady, as if to say that none of this had ever been about medals. It had always been about love seen clearly at last.